My name is Emily. I'm in my late 30s, a working mother, the kind of woman people describe as steady, practical, the reliable one. I've always sounded calmer than I feel. I don't raise my voice in public. I don't slam doors. I don't post cryptic quotes online. I'm the person who remembers dentist appointments, keeps receipts in labeled folders, and shows up early with extra snacks no one asked for, because someone has to. Most people underestimate women like me. They think calm means soft. They think quiet means unaware. They think that because I don't express my pain, I don't have any. Even in my own home, I was seen as the engine. Useful, dependable, almost background. I carried the load, and because I carried it without complaint, everyone around me slowly started treating it like the natural order of things. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic screaming matches or a perfectly timed mic drop moment. It's about something colder and harder to explain. The slow realization that you have been assigned a role you never agreed to play, and the moment you decide, silently, that you will no longer live inside someone else's script. There was a child I loved with my whole body, the way mothers do when they've lost sleep, lost weekends, lost pieces of themselves, and called it devotion. I believed I was building a life with my husband, and I believed the family we shared, messy, imperfect, real, was ours. But I would learn something that rearranged the meaning of every memory. I found out my daughter isn't mine, but the child of my husband and my cousin who lives with us. And it wasn't just betrayal, it was architecture. They played a perfect game, turning me into a nanny for their love child, while I worked to support their secret life. Not with obvious cruelty, but with small assumptions and quiet manipulations. So smooth, they almost felt like a coincidence. What you'll hear is the emotional journey of that discovery. The first small cuts I ignored. The way disrespect becomes normal when it's wrapped in family language. The private moments where the truth starts to leak through, and the calm, step-by-step choices I made when I stopped begging to be seen. There's no glamour in it, just clarity. And eventually, a kind of justice that doesn't need an audience to be real. Have you ever looked back at your own life and wondered how long you were carrying something that was never meant to be yours? Before everything fractured, I was the dependable one. In our house, dependability wasn't a compliment. It was a function. My husband Daniel used to introduce me to people as the organized half. He'd say it with a smile, arm draped loosely around my shoulders at company dinners. I'd forget my own head if it wasn't attached. He'd joke, and everyone would laugh. I laughed too. It felt harmless, at the time. My cousin Sophie moved in with us 2 years after our daughter was born. She said she needed a fresh start. Seattle was expensive, and family helps family. That's what I believed. She was warm in public, affectionate with the baby, and eager to help around the house. She called me Em in that nostalgic way that made it sound like childhood never ended. People described our household as modern, progressive, supportive, a successful couple, a sweet child, extended family under one roof. On social media, it probably looked generous, balanced, safe. But inside the walls, I slowly became infrastructure. I handled the mortgage, the health insurance, the grocery budget, school applications, pediatric appointments, tax filings. If something needed signing, it was mine. If something needed remembering, it was mine. If something went wrong, I fixed it quietly before it disrupted anyone else's comfort. Daniel worked in marketing, creative, charismatic, unpredictable hours. Sophie worked part-time at a boutique downtown. Flexible schedule, lots of errands. I had a stable income, the benefits, the retirement plan. And because I earned more, it became logical, at least on paper, that I should also be practical about everything else. Sophie bonded easily with my daughter. They had an ease that people commented on. She's so natural with her, neighbors would say. Your daughter lights up when Sophie walks in, Daniel once mentioned casually, scrolling on his phone. I told myself that was beautiful. It was healthy for a child to feel secure with multiple adults. I told myself I was lucky to have help. When I came home late from work, exhausted but still upright, Sophie would already be there, kneeling on the living room rug helping with puzzles. Daniel would be cooking or at least pretending to supervise dinner. They'd look up together when I walked in. There she is, Sophie would say brightly. Supermom. It sounded affectionate, but I started to notice something subtle. My daughter would run to Sophie first. Not every time, just enough. And when she needed comforting, sometimes she reached sideways before she reached forward. I told myself not to be insecure. Children go through phases. I work long hours. Of course, attachment patterns shift. But I also noticed how often my exhaustion became the punchline. "You're working too hard," Daniel would say, but never in a way that suggested he would work less. "You're so strong," Sophie would tell me, watching me pack lunches at midnight. "I don't know how you do it." They said it with admiration. It felt like an assignment. I was the reliable engine, the provider, the stable adult, the calm one, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, I became something else too. The woman who could be depended on to absorb discomfort. The woman who wouldn't make scenes. The woman who would always choose responsibility over emotion. Invisible women aren't erased overnight. They're repositioned, one small convenience at a time. Looking back, I don't think they saw me as weak. I think they saw me as useful. And usefulness, when it isn't protected by respect, becomes a trap. The first cut wasn't loud. There was no lipstick on a collar. No suspicious text message lighting up a screen at midnight. No cinematic moment where the music shifts and the camera zooms in. It was a Tuesday. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows. I remember because Seattle rain always makes the house feel smaller. I had taken the afternoon off for my daughter's preschool family art day. I don't usually take time off midweek. My calendar is layered in color codes and obligations. But I'd promised her. When I arrived, I saw them before they saw me. Daniel was crouched beside our daughter's tiny table, holding her paint cup steady while she dragged bright blue streaks across paper. Sophie sat on the other side, laughing gently as she wiped a smudge from our daughter's cheek. They looked cohesive, like a photograph you'd frame. I stood there longer than necessary, not because something was obviously wrong, but because I felt like I was looking through glass. When Daniel finally noticed me, he smiled. "Oh, Em, you made it. You made it. Not we were waiting for you. Not she's been asking for you. Just, you made it." Sophie beamed at me. "We weren't sure if your meeting would run late." I don't remember telling her about the meeting. I'd told Daniel. Maybe he mentioned it. That's normal, right? Married people share schedules. I told myself that. I walked over, kissed my daughter's hair, and she smiled. But then she turned back to Sophie to show her the painting. "Look, Auntie Soph, it's us." In U.S. On the paper were 3 stick figures holding hands. One tall, one medium, one small. All labeled in uneven preschool handwriting. Daddy, Soph, me. I stared at it longer than I should have. Daniel laughed lightly. "Guess I've been replaced." Replaced. Everyone chuckled. I smiled too. Because what else do you do in a room full of tiny chairs and other parents watching? Later that evening, I asked Daniel about it. Not accusing, just curious. "She probably just sees Sophie more during the day," he said. "You know how attached kids get." Attached. It was reasonable, logical, even flattering in a way. Sophie was helpful, present, gentle. Still, something in my chest tightened. Not sharp, just a faint pull, like fabric snagging on a nail. The next small cut came a week later. I opened our joint credit card statement to reconcile expenses, like I always do. There was a charge at a waterfront cafe on a weekday afternoon. A place Daniel never goes alone. Too romantic, he used to joke. When I asked casually, he didn't hesitate. "Oh, Sophie needed to talk. She's been stressed about money. I took her out so she wouldn't feel awkward." He said it with kindness, like I should be proud of him. I nodded. That night, as I loaded the dishwasher, I heard them laughing upstairs in the hallway. A low, easy rhythm. Familiar. I told myself I was being paranoid. Families laugh together. Cousins talk. Husbands offer support. But the feeling didn't leave. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a suspicion strong enough to name. It was displacement. Like slowly being edited out of your own photograph. And the most unsettling part, no one else seemed to notice anything unusual, which made me question whether the cut had happened at all. But I remembered the painting. 3 stick figures, not 4, and I remembered the way my daughter said us. Sometimes the first warning isn't a betrayal. It's a shift in gravity, and you feel yourself moving without understanding why. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It doesn't kick down doors. It doesn't throw plates. It doesn't even look like cruelty at first. It looks like practicality, like convenience, like everyone adjusting to what works best. After the art day, I had told myself I was overthinking. I am trained to audit numbers, not emotions. If something feels unstable, my instinct is to correct my own interpretation before accusing anyone else of imbalance. So I adjusted. I started coming home earlier when I could. I volunteered to do bedtime more often. I rearranged conference calls around school pickups. I told myself this was what engaged mothers do. But even as I moved closer, I felt something subtle. The role I held had already shifted. Sophie began answering questions directed at me. At dinner one night, Daniel asked, "What time is the pediatric appointment next week?" I opened my mouth. Sophie answered first. "Thursday at 3:30. I put it in the shared calendar." Daniel nodded toward her. "Good catch. Good catch." I scheduled the appointment. I entered it into the calendar, but somehow she became the one associated with it. It was small, harmless technically. I told myself that sharing responsibility was healthy. Then came the birthday party planning. Our daughter wanted a backyard party. Unicorn theme, glitter everywhere. I was the one comparing rental quotes, coordinating with the bakery, and confirming RSVPs. But when guests arrived, Sophie floated through the yard, organizing games, adjusting decorations, and guiding children from station to station. "She's amazing with kids," one of the moms told me. "You're so lucky to have her," another added. "Lucky." I smiled and refilled juice boxes. Daniel stood beside Sophie when the cake came out. They both held it together, while our daughter blew out candles. I stood behind the camera. Invisibility doesn't feel dramatic. It feels logistical, like you're always slightly behind the frame. There were other moments, inside jokes I didn't understand, shared glances over references to errands I hadn't heard about. When I asked, the explanations were clear. "Oh, we just ran into each other downtown. She needed help with her car. You were busy. I didn't want to bother you." Busy. It became the explanation for everything. You're busy. You're strong. You're capable. You don't need help. On the surface, those are compliments. But over time, they become permission for others to redirect emotional intimacy elsewhere. One evening, I came downstairs after finishing quarterly reports. The house was quiet except for soft music playing in the kitchen. Daniel and Sophie were sitting across from each other at the island. Wine glasses are half full. The conversation stopped when I walked in. Not abruptly, just gently paused. "Oh, Sophie smiled. "We didn't think you'd be done yet. Didn't think you'd be done yet." As if my presence had a schedule. Daniel kissed my cheek. "We were just talking about her maybe going back to school. I told her she's capable of anything." I nodded. That should have been normal. Encouraging, family support. But I noticed something else. He hadn't told me about that conversation before. I learned about my cousin's future plans at the same time she did. It wasn't one large betrayal. It was the repetition of being slightly outside the circle. And each time, I told myself, don't be insecure, don't be dramatic, don't make something out of nothing. Because calm women are rewarded for tolerance. And I had built my identity around being calm. But something inside me had started keeping quiet records. Not accusations, observations. And the most dangerous shift wasn't what they were doing. It was what I was allowing myself to normalize. There's a moment in every long imbalance when you realize the pattern isn't accidental. It's structural. For me, that moment didn't arrive with proof. It arrived with clarity. It was a Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my planner open, mapping out the month. Tuition payments, utility due dates, Sophie's contribution schedule, Daniel's fluctuating freelance invoices. I manage money the way some people manage emotions. Quietly, precisely, without spectacle. From the living room, I could hear laughter. Daniel was teaching our daughter how to ride her scooter in the hallway. Sophie trailed behind them, cheering dramatically, clapping when she made it 3 feet without wobbling. I listened to the rhythm of it. Encouragement, applause, shared excitement. Then my daughter fell. Not badly, just a small tumble. I stood instinctively, but before I could reach the doorway, Sophie was already kneeling beside her, arms open. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "Baby." Daniel hovered close, brushing hair from her face, and I stopped walking. Not because I wasn't needed, but because I suddenly understood something uncomfortable. They didn't expect me to be the first responder. They expected me to be the stabilizer, the one who cleans up after the emotion has passed, the one who makes sure the scooter is returned, the hallway is cleared, and the ice pack is wrapped in a paper towel. Reliable, useful, not central. That afternoon, I overheard Sophie on the phone with a friend. "She works so much," she was saying softly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm more of a mom during the week." There was no malice in her tone. That's what made it sharper. She believed it, and no one had corrected her. When Daniel later mentioned that Sophie had been a lifesaver, I asked carefully, "In what way?" He looked confused. "With everything. With her. You know how demanding your job is. Your job, your responsibility, your absence. The narrative had shifted, and I hadn't noticed when it became official. I was the provider, the infrastructure, the dependable backbone. Sophie was the nurturer, the present one, the emotional constant. Daniel floated between us, benefiting from both roles. And because I rarely complained, because I never shouted, because I always handled crises without theatrics, my strength had been quietly repurposed into distance. The role assigned to me wasn't villainous. It was practical. I was the one who could handle it, so they let me. At dinner that night, Sophie casually asked if I could cover more of the groceries this month because her hours had been cut. Daniel didn't even look up from his phone. "You make more anyway," he said lightly. "Anyway," as if that settled the math of fairness. I agreed. Of course I did, because numbers don't lie. I did make more, but that wasn't the point. The point was this. No one asked what I needed. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if I felt displaced in my own home. They assumed I was fine because I functioned, and I began to see the shape of the design. They weren't pushing me out. They were positioning me exactly where I was most convenient, and I had stepped into that space willingly, mistaking usefulness for love. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still, because once you see the role you've been assigned, you have to decide whether to keep performing it. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no shattered glass. It happened in a hospital hallway that smelled like disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Our daughter had developed a persistent fever. Nothing dramatic, just high enough that the pediatrician recommended blood work to rule out infection. Daniel had a critical client meeting. Sophie offered to take her. "I'll handle it," she said gently. "You don't need to miss work again." I almost agreed automatically. Almost. But something in me resisted. "I'll take her," I said instead. Sophie hesitated for half a second too long. "Are you sure? She gets anxious with needles." I smiled. "So do I." The nurse was kind, efficient. She wrapped a cartoon bandage around my daughter's arm after drawing the blood. I held her small body against mine while she cried. And then something happened that rearranged the air in my lungs. The nurse glanced at the chart. "Is Mom in the waiting room?" she asked casually. I blinked. "I'm her mother." The nurse frowned slightly, scanning the form again. "Oh, I'm sorry. The emergency contact listed as primary caregiver is Sophie Martin." "Sophie, primary caregiver. Not secondary. Not additional contact. Primary." I felt the word settle in my stomach like a stone. "That must be outdated," I said calmly. The nurse shrugged. "It's what was submitted last year during her enrollment update." Last year, I knew exactly when that update was filed. I had signed the insurance forms. I had provided the tax documents. But I hadn't personally dropped off the preschool paperwork that week. Daniel said he'd handle it. I didn't confront him in the hospital parking lot. I didn't call Sophie. I didn't even change my breathing. I drove home in silence. Inside the house, everything looked the same. The same throw pillows, the same framed photos, the same scent of lavender cleaner. But something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't about bonding anymore. It wasn't about who read bedtime stories. It was administrative, documented, institutional. Someone had positioned my cousin as the primary caregiver on official forms, and I hadn't known. That night, while Daniel showered, I opened my laptop. I didn't snoop through phones. I didn't search for dramatic evidence. I simply accessed what I already had permission to see. Shared email, insurance portals, school accounts, and there it was. In the preschool contact update from 11 months ago, primary guardian, Sophie Martin. Secondary, Daniel Carter. Additional contact, Emily Carter. Additional. I stared at the word for a long time. My name had been shifted to the margin of my own child's life. Not erased. Just repositioned. Strategically. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. Because, for the first time, this wasn't a feeling. It was a fact. And facts are something I know how to handle. When Daniel came downstairs, toweling his hair, I closed the laptop gently. "How did it go?" he asked. "Fine," I said evenly. "Blood work is normal." He kissed my forehead absently and went to the kitchen. I watched him move around the space like nothing had changed. And I realized something critical. The shift inside me was invisible. They would not see it. They would mistake my quiet for compliance. They would assume the structure remained intact. But something had moved into place. Not rage, not revenge, clarity. For the first time, I wasn't asking whether I was imagining things. I knew. And once you know that your role has been officially rewritten without your consent, you stop performing it automatically. That was the day I stopped being confused and started paying attention. After the hospital, I didn't confront anyone. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like mine. They imagine a dramatic scene. Papers thrown across the table, accusations fired like bullets. But confrontation requires urgency, and I was no longer urgent. I was deliberate. The next morning, I woke up at the same time. Made coffee, packed lunches, signed the same permission slips. My voice carried the same steady tone it always had. If anything, I became softer. Daniel didn't notice. Sophie didn't notice. That was the advantage of being the calm one. When you change internally, it doesn't register externally. But my silence was no longer automatic. It was chosen. At breakfast, Sophie mentioned she might need to step up more officially if my workload kept increasing. I just want what's best for her, she said, stroking my daughter's hair. Daniel nodded. It's good she has consistency. Consistency. I took a slow sip of coffee. Yes, I agreed. Consistency is important. I let them interpret my agreement however they wanted. That evening, instead of opening my planner at the kitchen table, I took it upstairs, behind a closed door. I began auditing not just expenses but structures, mortgage documents, deed ownership, bank account allocations, beneficiary designations, college savings plans. Every account that had once felt like shared architecture now felt like leverage. I wasn't searching for a scandal. I was mapping power. I noticed something interesting. Almost everything financial was in my name first. My credit built the mortgage. My income stabilized the accounts. Even the preschool tuition was auto-drafted from my personal account before transferring into joint expense reconciliation. Useful women often underestimate their own centrality. I had mistaken my contributions as background support. In reality, I was the foundation. Over the next few weeks, I practiced a new kind of quiet. I stopped volunteering information about my schedule. I stopped offering to cover shortfalls automatically. When Sophie asked if I could switch my day off to accommodate her plans, I smiled gently. I won't be able to, I said. No explanation, no apology. She blinked, surprised, but recovered quickly. Oh, okay. I'll figure it out. Figure it out. That phrase told me more than she realized. For years, I had figured everything out before it became a burden to anyone else. Now I let small inconveniences exist. Daniel mentioned feeling stressed about a client payment delay. I'm sure you'll manage it, I said evenly. The same words he'd used for me countless times. He looked at me for a second longer than usual. Not suspicious, just unsettled, because something subtle had changed. I was still calm, still functional, still responsible, but I was no longer absorbing the emotional overflow of the household. Silence when unconscious is submission. Silence when strategic is preparation. They mistook my composure for acceptance. They interpreted my steadiness as reassurance. They had grown comfortable with the idea that I would never destabilize the system. What they didn't realize was that systems depend on foundations, and foundations can shift without noise. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about exposure. I was recalibrating. And the most powerful part? They felt safe, because I didn't look angry. I looked the same, but inside I was no longer confused. I was measuring, and when you begin measuring quietly, you eventually reach a conclusion. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like a woman who still wakes up at 6, still packs lunches, still answers emails in measured tones. It looks like someone who hasn't changed at all. That was my advantage. They thought my stillness meant surrender. In reality, it meant I was gathering information. I didn't search for incriminating messages. I didn't dig through phones. I didn't need theatrics. Patterns were enough. I began by requesting copies of all official records tied to my daughter's school enrollment files, medical consent forms, and emergency contact logs. Not confrontationally. I framed it as organizing documents for future planning. No one questioned it. I noticed how often Sophie's signature appeared where mine should have been. Field trip permissions, after-school activity forms, parent liaison emails. In several places, she wasn't listed as cousin. She was listed simply as guardian. The word appeared casually, as if it had always belonged there. I printed everything, not to wave in someone's face, but to understand the scale. Then I reviewed our financial flows more carefully. I had always covered more. That wasn't new. But I began to quantify it precisely. Percentage splits, documented transfers, and unpaid contributions. I created a private spreadsheet that mapped every dollar over the past 3 years. Patterns emerged. When Daniel's freelance income dipped, I absorbed the difference. When Sophie's hours were reduced, I increased grocery coverage. When preschool tuition rose, I adjusted retirement contributions instead of asking for shared sacrifice. There was no conspiracy in the numbers, just an imbalance. An imbalance, when sustained, reveals intent. I also began observing timing. When did Daniel schedule client dinners? When did Sophie suddenly run errands at the same hours? I didn't accuse. I cross-referenced calendar timestamps, location tags on shared family photos, Uber receipts tied to joint accounts. Small overlaps, nothing explosive, but consistent. One evening, I noticed something that changed the texture of everything. I was reviewing our shared cloud storage when I found a folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't hidden, just unremarkable, labeled Family Admin. Inside were scanned documents I had never seen. Birth certificate copies, insurance updates, medical consent revisions, my daughter's birth certificate. I opened the scanned image. I had seen it before, of course, years ago, but I hadn't examined it recently. Father, Daniel Carter. Mother, Emily Carter. Everything appeared standard, except for the scan timestamp. It was updated 18 months ago. Reissued. Why would a birth certificate need to be reissued? I didn't panic. I didn't spiral. I requested an official certified copy directly from the county office under the pretense of needing it for school enrollment backup. When it arrived a week later, I compared the two versions side by side. There was a subtle difference in formatting, slight variations in typeface alignment. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough to make me question the timeline. That night, while the house slept, I pulled out the hospital discharge folder from the year she was born. I keep everything, and that's when I saw it. The original lab record is attached to the neonatal paperwork. Blood type. My blood type is O positive. Daniel's is a positive. Our daughter's recorded type, a B negative. At the time, I hadn't thought deeply about compatibility. Hospitals manage that. Science handles that. But I work with data, and something about that combination pressed against logic. I didn't jump to conclusions. I researched quietly. Blood type inheritance charts, genetic probability, medical journals, and the calm inside me grew colder. I scheduled a routine pediatric follow-up 2 weeks later. I requested a standard blood panel update, framed as medical record consistency. No one questioned it. When the new results came in, I asked the lab technician one simple question. Can two parents with O and A positive produce a B negative? She hesitated. It's highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Not impossible, but statistically strained. That was the moment I understood something devastating. Not because of rage, not because of betrayal theatrics, but because the math didn't align, and I have never been afraid of numbers. What they never noticed was this. While they believed I was too busy to pay attention, I was studying everything, quietly, systematically, without emotion clouding the pattern. And when patterns become undeniable, you don't explode, you prepare. I didn't confront them after the blood type conversation. Probability isn't proof. And I am not a woman who builds her life decisions on highly unlikely. I needed certainty, but certainty requires patience. So I created a reason. At our daughter's next pediatric visit, I mentioned wanting to update family medical records for insurance compliance. I requested a comprehensive genetic screening panel, framed as preventative care. No one objected. Preventive care sounds responsible. I have always sounded responsible. Daniel didn't attend the appointment. Sophie offered to come, but I declined gently. I've got it, I said. That phrase again. I've got it. The results took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of normal dinners, normal conversations, normal laughter echoes down the hallway. 3 weeks of watching them move through the house with casual familiarity. If there was guilt, it wasn't visible. If there was fear, it was well hidden. But I noticed something subtle during those weeks. Daniel began being slightly more attentive to Sophie's schedule than mine. Small check-ins. Text notifications light up his phone screen with her name more frequently than before. Not secretive, just comfortable. The lab portal notified me on a Thursday morning. I was at my office desk when the email arrived. Results available. I closed my door before opening the file. The report was clinical, structured, unemotional. Genetic compatibility analysis. Maternal match probability, 0%. Paternal match probability, 99.9%, Daniel Carter. I stared at the numbers without blinking, 0%. There is something uniquely disorienting about seeing your absence quantified, not metaphorically erased. Biologically excluded. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I felt something much more precise. Alignment. All the small cuts, the administrative shifts, the primary caregiver designation, the quiet repositioning. They weren't random. They were structural corrections to a truth that had always existed. I wasn't her biological mother, and somehow they had built an entire household architecture around that fact without ever allowing me to see it clearly. I drove home that evening in complete silence. When I walked into the house, Sophie was helping my daughter with homework at the dining table. Daniel stood behind them, leaning down to point at a worksheet. It was such an ordinary image. Domestic, intimate, whole. For a second, just a second, I allowed myself to see it without emotion. They looked like a family, not the one I thought I had, but a coherent one. My daughter looked up when I entered. Hi, Mom. The word didn't sting. It echoed. Because of motherhood, I realized in that moment, isn't erased by biology. But it is complicated by deception. Sophie glanced at me, smiling easily. We were just finishing spelling practice. We. I nodded. That's good. I moved past them into the kitchen and placed my bag down carefully. My hands were steady. I wasn't furious. Fury requires surprise. I was no longer surprised. I was informed. Later that night, after everyone slept, I opened my planner. I wrote one sentence across a blank page. The truth is no longer negotiable. Not because I planned to expose them immediately. Not because I wanted confrontation, but because clarity changes posture. Until that moment, I had been operating inside uncertainty. Now I was operating inside fact. I didn't feel hatred toward my daughter. If anything, I felt protective. She was the only one in this house who had not chosen deception. Daniel and Sophie had. They had orchestrated timelines, signed documents, updated records, played the long game. They had turned me into infrastructure for a child that was biologically theirs. They had positioned me as the financial stabilizer, the nanny with legal access and emotional labor, while they maintained proximity. It was strategic, and I respected the strategy. What they failed to calculate was this. Strategy works best when the foundation remains unaware. Now the foundation knew. And foundations don't collapse loudly. They shift weight. I closed the planner and turned off the light. In the dark, I felt something unfamiliar, but not destructive. Control. Not over them. Over myself. The reveal had happened privately. No audience. No explosion. Just numbers. And once numbers align with intuition, decisions become irreversible. Once you know the truth, there's a brief window where you still get to choose who you will be inside it. I had options. I could confront them immediately, place the lab results on the kitchen table, and demand an explanation. I could wake the house at midnight and force clarity through shock. I could file for divorce without warning and let lawyers deliver what I didn't feel like saying. All of those options were available to me, but I've never made decisions from injury. I make them from the outcome. So I asked myself a simpler question. What future do I want to build from this truth? If I stayed without addressing it, I would become complicit in my own erasure. If I exposed them recklessly, I would destabilize a child who had done nothing wrong. If I left without preparation, I would forfeit the leverage I had spent years building. There is a difference between reaction and resolution. Reaction is emotional relief. Resolution is a structural correction. I chose correction. The irreversible option wasn't confrontation. It was a withdrawal. Not emotionally, strategically. Over the next week, I met with a family law attorney during my lunch breaks. Not dramatically, not tearfully. I framed it as exploring legal clarification regarding guardianship and marital assets. The attorney asked precise questions. Are you the biological mother? No. Does your husband know that you know? No. Are you listed on the birth certificate? Yes. She paused. That changes everything. Not morally. Legally. We discussed timelines, custody rights, fraud implications, asset division. I didn't ask for revenge scenarios. I asked for pathways. What protects the child? I asked first. The attorney nodded slightly. Documentation protects the child. Stability protects the child. Sudden confrontation does not. That aligned with my instincts. I began transferring portions of my salary into a newly established individual account. Completely legal. Completely documented. My income, my right. I adjusted beneficiaries quietly. I requested updated property appraisals under the pretense of a refinancing evaluation. No one questioned it. Daniel was too comfortable. Sophie was too confident. They believed the system was stable. At dinner one evening, Daniel mentioned a possible family trip in the summer. We should plan something special, he said. The three of us deserve it. The three of us. He didn't notice what he'd said. Or maybe he did. I smiled lightly. Let's see how the next few months go, I replied. It wasn't passive. It was accurate. Because the next few months would determine everything. The decision I made wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming authorship. For years, I had been cast in a supporting role inside a story built on a mission. Now I was rewriting the ending. And rewriting doesn't require shouting. It requires timing. There is a particular calm that comes when you stop negotiating with denial. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't seeking reassurance. I wasn't waiting for them to confess. I had facts. I had legal standing. I had financial leverage. And most importantly, I had clarity without hatred. That's a dangerous combination. Because when someone acts from anger, you can predict them. When someone acts from calm certainty, you cannot. I chose the path that would change everything. Not overnight. Not explosively, but permanently. And once I set it in motion, there was no version of this story where I returned to being infrastructure. Once a decision becomes internal, the external world doesn't immediately shift. That's what makes quiet action so powerful. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different. I still pack lunches, still sign permission slips, still ask Daniel how his meetings went, still thank Sophie when she folded laundry. Routine is camouflage. But beneath that routine, I began restructuring the ground beneath us. The first step was documentation. My attorney advised me to preserve everything: emails, forms, medical records, and financial transfers. Not dramatically, just methodically. I created encrypted digital folders, time-stamped files. Backup copies are stored outside the house. No accusations, just archives. Then I scheduled a paternity test through a certified legal lab, this time with full chain of custody procedures. I framed it to Daniel as a requirement from our insurance provider due to medical record inconsistencies. He frowned slightly. "That seems unnecessary." "It's administrative," I replied calmly. "It protects everyone." He didn't argue. He rarely argued with paperwork. Sophie seemed slightly tense that week. Not overtly, just quieter when certain topics came up. But neither of them suspected the scale of what was unfolding, because I never changed tone. Financially, I adjusted slowly. I stopped covering shortfalls automatically. When bills were divided, I sent clear summaries of expenses and requested proportional contributions. No anger, just clarity. Daniel was mildly surprised. "You've never been this strict about it before." "I've never audited it properly before," I said evenly. That was true. For years, I had absorbed imbalance as emotional generosity. Now I treat finances like what they are: agreements. I also initiated a consultation with a property attorney regarding the house title, because the mortgage was primarily secured under my credit profile. The leverage was significant. Again, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just understanding. One evening, Daniel suggested that Sophie might look into becoming more officially recognized in school records, since she was so involved. I looked at him steadily. "Official recognition requires legal clarity," I said. "That might open doors you don't want opened." There was a pause. He didn't push further. That was the first flicker of unease I saw. Not guilt. Calculation. Meanwhile, I scheduled a private session with a child psychologist. Not for therapy yet, but for guidance. I asked one question. If a child discovers later that her maternal identity was concealed, what is the least traumatic way to transition truth? The psychologist's answer was simple: stability first, shock last. That affirmed my pace. The legal paternity results arrived 2 weeks later. 99.9% paternal match to Daniel, 0% maternal match to me. Certified, sealed, admissible. I placed the document inside my planner, between pages labeled June and July. I didn't show it to anyone, not yet, because moving in silence means understanding timing. Daniel and Sophie began to sense something was off, not because I confronted them, but because I stopped filling emotional gaps. When tension surfaced, I didn't smooth it. When schedules clashed, I didn't rearrange mine automatically. When Sophie forgot to pay her portion of utilities, I sent a reminder instead of covering it. Small boundaries feel like earthquakes in systems built on imbalance, but I remained composed, calm, predictable, which made it harder for them to name what was shifting. They couldn't accuse me of anger. They couldn't accuse me of instability. From the outside, I was simply precise. And precision unsettles people who relied on your flexibility. The final step before confrontation wasn't dramatic. It was logistical. My attorney prepared a draft petition: custody clarification, marital dissolution, and asset protection. Not filed yet, just ready. Because when you move quietly, the goal isn't to surprise. It's to ensure that when the moment arrives, you are already standing on solid ground. And I was. Consequences don't always announce themselves with headlines. Sometimes they begin as an inconvenience. The first shift they felt was financial. When Sophie's portion of utilities remained unpaid past the due date, I didn't cover it. I sent a simple message in the group chat: utility payment is outstanding. Please transfer by Friday to avoid late fees. No emoji, no softness. Daniel replied with a thumbs up. Sophie transferred the amount that evening. The next month, I divided grocery expenses precisely based on documented usage averages. I had numbers, patterns, receipts. Daniel looked at the spreadsheet I emailed and laughed lightly. "You're turning into an accountant on us." "I've always been one," I said calmly, but something had changed. Previously, money flowed through me like oxygen, unnoticed, constant. Now it had weight, edges, accountability. The second shift was logistical. When Daniel suggested Sophie attend a school meeting as usual, I responded before she could. "I'll be there," I said. He hesitated. "You've got a quarterly review that day." I rescheduled it. He He studied me for a second too long. At the meeting, I introduced myself clearly. I'm her legal mother. The word landed deliberately. The school administrator glanced between us, sensing something unsaid. Sophie remained polite, but quieter than usual. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in her expression. Not fear, just recalculation. They had grown comfortable with my distance. My presence disrupted that comfort. At home, tension began surfacing in subtle ways. Daniel became more attentive, bringing me coffee in the mornings, asking about my work with unusual interest. "How are you feeling lately?" he asked one night. "Focused," I replied. That answer unsettled him. Focused suggests direction. Direction implies change. Sophie, meanwhile, grew slightly more possessive of time with my daughter, as if trying to reinforce something invisible. Extra outings, extra affection, extra bedtime stories. I didn't interfere. I observed. Because consequences aren't about punishment. They're about pressure, and pressure reveals fault lines. The third shift was emotional. I stopped absorbing their discomfort. When Daniel expressed stress about a client loss, I listened, but didn't immediately propose solutions. When Sophie sighed about being overwhelmed, I nodded, but didn't rearrange my schedule to accommodate her. They began experiencing the weight of responsibility without my buffer, and they didn't like it. One evening, I overheard them speaking in low tones in the kitchen. "She's different," Sophie whispered. "She's just stressed," Daniel replied. "No, it's more than that." There it was. Awareness, but not yet understanding. They felt the ground shifting without knowing why. That's the unsettling part about structural change. It doesn't argue. It adjusts. The most significant consequence, though, wasn't financial or logistical. It was psychological. They had built a system assuming my compliance. When compliance disappeared, even gently, the entire rhythm changed. Daniel began asking more questions about paperwork. "Why are you requesting updated property valuations?" "Just reviewing assets," I said evenly. Sophie grew cautious around official forms. "Do you need to sign this?" she asked me one afternoon, handing over a school document. "Yes," I replied, taking the pen without hesitation. That hesitation hadn't existed before. The house still looked the same. We still ate dinner together. We still functioned as a family on the surface. But comfort had been replaced with uncertainty. Not because I threatened them, because I stopped protecting the illusion. And when illusions lose protection, they begin to crack quietly. The consequences had begun. They could feel it. They just didn't know where it was leading. I did. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in through small cracks. The first visible fracture came on a Thursday evening when Daniel asked, too casually, "Have you been talking to a lawyer?" I didn't look up from my planner. "Yes." Silence expanded between us. "About what?" he asked carefully. "Clarification," I replied. "Legal structures, guardianship, asset protection." Sophie, who had been rinsing dishes at the sink, froze for a fraction of a second. The water kept running. Daniel forced a light laugh. "That seems extreme." "Preparation isn't extreme," I said calmly. "It's responsible." That word again. Responsible. For years, they had relied on me to be exactly that. Responsible enough not to destabilize anything. Now, responsibility was no longer cushioning them. It was outlining consequences. Over the next few days, their behavior shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Daniel became unusually affectionate. Compliments resurfaced. Old inside jokes reappeared like artifacts being dusted off. "You've always been the strongest person I know," he said one night, holding my hand a little too deliberately. Sophie began offering to reduce her financial dependence. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured softly. "You've done so much for us." U.S. The words sounded different now, less confident. They weren't confessing. They weren't admitting. They were trying to rebalance perception, as if kindness could rewind documentation. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than expected. I heard them speaking in the living room, voices low and tight. "She knows something," Sophie whispered. "She can't know," Daniel said sharply. "She's pulling records. She's changed everything." I stepped into the doorway. They both looked up. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask. "I've updated the insurance beneficiaries," I said evenly. "We'll review everything formally next week." Daniel stood slowly. "Emily, what is this really about?" I held his gaze. "It's about alignment." He swallowed. "Alignment with what?" "The truth." The word hung there. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she set down her glass. "Emily," she began, but I didn't let her finish. "Not tonight." Calm, measured, irreversible. That's when panic truly set in. Not explosive, but destabilizing. Because they understood something critical. This wasn't an emotional reaction that could be soothed. It wasn't jealousy that could be reassured. It wasn't insecurity that could be comforted. It was structural, legal, documented. They began asking questions more directly. "Are you planning to leave? Are you trying to take everything? Why are you doing this now? The irony was almost quiet enough to miss. Why now? Because now I knew. Because now the math was undeniable. Because now the foundation had clarity. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to apologize. It means too late to restore the original power dynamic. Even if they confessed in that moment, even if they fell to their knees and told the full story, nothing would change the fact that deception had been embedded into paperwork, into signatures, into years of administrative maneuvering. Trust isn't broken by a single lie. It's eroded by coordination, and coordination cannot be undone with sentiment. That week, Daniel barely slept. Sophie avoided prolonged eye contact. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Not because I was shouting, because I wasn't. When calm replaces confusion, people lose their ability to predict you. And unpredictability terrifies those who relied on your stability. They began to understand something that hadn't occurred to them before. I wasn't trapped. They were. And it was too late to fix the version of me that used to accept less than the truth. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon. Not at midnight, not during an argument, not in front of our daughter. I chose Sunday because it's the quietest day in our house. Light filters through the kitchen windows in a softer way. There are no deadlines pressing against the walls. I asked Sophie to take our daughter to the park. I need to speak with Daniel alone, I said calmly. She looked at me for a long moment. Not defiant, not innocent, just aware. When the door closed behind them, the house felt unusually still. Daniel stood near the dining table, hands braced against the back of a chair. "What is this?" he asked. I walked to the table and placed a slim folder down between us. Inside were 3 documents: the certified paternity results, the genetic incompatibility report, copies of the school forms listing Sophie as the primary guardian. I didn't slide them dramatically. I simply opened the folder. He looked down. At first confusion, then comprehension, then something quieter. Calculation dissolving into inevitability. He sank into the chair. "How long?" he asked, voice low. "Long enough," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, it wasn't supposed to..." "Don't explain it as an accident," I said gently. "It required coordination." He closed his eyes. Silence filled the room. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't angry. I was finished pretending not to know. "Is she..." He hesitated. "Does she know?" "No." "And Sophie?" "She suspects I've uncovered something." He exhaled slowly. "It started before she moved in," he admitted quietly. We thought it would be easier this way. Easier to let me carry the financial weight, to let me sign the forms, to let me believe. "Whose idea was it?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "It just happened." I held his gaze. "No, it was maintained. There's a difference. An affair can be impulsive. An arrangement requires intention." He nodded faintly, as if acknowledging a truth he couldn't defend. "I loved you," he said. "I don't doubt that," I replied evenly. "But love without honesty is architecture without foundation." He looked smaller then. Not villainous, just exposed. "I never meant to replace you," he whispered. "You did," I said calmly. "On paper. In structure, in proximity." He flinched, not at anger, but at accuracy. "I'm filing," I continued. "Custody, clarification, divorce, asset division." His head snapped up. "You're taking her away?" "I'm protecting stability," I said. "She deserves truth handled correctly, not collapse." He swallowed hard. "And Sophie? She will have the opportunity to step into the role she's been occupying. Legally." The air shifted. This wasn't revenge. It was a transfer. "You're not shouting," he said quietly. "There's nothing to shout about, because the damage had already been done in silence." This was simply an acknowledgement. When Sophie returned later that afternoon, Daniel told her I had confronted him. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, eyes searching my face. "Emily, I know," I said gently. Tears filled her eyes. Not dramatic, not hysterical, just heavy. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "You chose not to consider me," I replied. "There is a difference." No insults were exchanged, no doors slammed, only the quiet dismantling of a structure built on omission. And when it was done, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. Because truth, once spoken calmly, doesn't explode. It settles. People imagine that after something like this, you either shatter or harden. I did neither. The legal process unfolded the way structured things do. Meetings, signatures, waiting periods, documentation. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no public humiliation, just the quiet reallocation of responsibilities. Custody was clarified. Biology could no longer be denied, but neither could history. I had raised her. I had loved her. I had shown up. That mattered. The final agreement reflected something balanced. Shared custody, transparent parental acknowledgement, and financial accountability aligned with truth. Sophie stepped into legal motherhood. Daniel stepped into consequence, and I stepped out of invisibility. We told our daughter together, guided by the child psychologist I had consulted months earlier. Age-appropriate, gentle, focused on love, not betrayal. There are different ways families are built, I told her softly. Sometimes grown-ups make complicated choices, but none of it changes how much you've been cared for. She asked simple questions. Children don't seek scandal. They seek safety. We gave her that, and then life rearranged itself. Daniel moved out within 3 months. Sophie followed shortly after, into a small townhouse across the city. They are building something that looks more honest now. I don't interfere. That is their structure to maintain. As for me, the house feels different. Quieter, but not empty. For the first time in years, the silence in my home isn't weighted with omission. It's clean. I kept my job. I kept my planner. I kept my steadiness. But I no longer confuse steadiness with self-erasure. I have learned something essential about quiet women. We are not weak. We are observant. And when we stop performing compliance, the world feels the shift even if we never raise our voices. I don't hate them. Hatred requires emotional investment I no longer owe. I don't regret loving my daughter. Love given sincerely is never wasted, even when its context changes. What I regret gently is how long I believed that usefulness equaled belonging. It doesn't. Belonging requires truth. I walk differently now. Not dramatically, just aligned. I ask direct questions. I read every document fully. I do not volunteer to absorb imbalance. And when something feels off, I investigate quietly instead of doubting myself. That is who I am now. Not a victim, not a villain, not the nanny. A woman who understands her leverage and her limits. A woman who knows that calm can be a strategy, not a surrender. And most importantly, a woman who no longer accepts roles she did not choose. If you've stayed with me this long, you already understand that this was never just a story about betrayal. It was a story about positioning, about how easily a capable woman can be turned into infrastructure for someone else's comfort. How love, when mixed with silence, can slowly become accommodation. And how accommodation, repeated long enough, becomes identity. For years, I believed my strength was my endurance. I thought being calm meant absorbing more. I thought being responsible meant carrying what others avoided. I thought love meant staying steady no matter what. But I've learned something quieter and more powerful. Endurance without truth is self-erasure. Calm without boundaries is permission. Responsibility without reciprocity becomes exploitation. What happened in my home wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was coordinated. Paperwork was signed. Roles were assigned. Narratives were adjusted. Softly, gradually, almost politely. And that's what makes stories like this dangerous. Because nothing looks broken from the outside. You can be deeply displaced and still appear stable. You can be erased administratively while smiling at dinner. The turning point wasn't when I confronted them. It was when I stopped questioning my own perception. When I trusted the pattern instead of dismissing it. When I chose preparation over reaction. There was no revenge, no humiliation, no shouting, just alignment. And sometimes alignment is the most powerful form of justice. If you find yourself in a situation where you are always the strong one, the reliable one, the one who can handle it, pause for a moment and ask yourself, are you being respected? Or are you simply being used because you don't complain? Quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about refusing to participate in your own diminishment. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever mistaken being needed for being valued? Tell me in the comments. I read every story. And if this resonated with you, stay. There are more truths we don't say out loud. And sometimes saying them calmly changes everything.